Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second week of online UWC, an online class on sustainability. And while everyone is busy making it to this class, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to get everything ready while I do a basic introduction to what we're going to talk about today and who I am. Now, today's class is the second live session, and it is about climate change and climate refugees, particularly in an Asian and Pacific setting. But we will take examples from all over the world and also discuss not just climate refugees, but migration in a wider global context. Now, you might wonder, who am I to talk about climate refugees? What makes me an expert in this particular topic? I think one of the reasons that I've been asked to talk to you about this is that I'm currently pursuing a PhD in migration and social media at Aalborg University in Denmark. Now, this means that my particular focus and my research is changed over time, and especially about how things such as the internet, online education, etc., influences migrants, their ability to move, their likelihood of being integrated within new societies, etc. But even more importantly, I'm qualified to talk to you all in an online UWC setting because I'm a graduate of UWC, the school in America where I graduated in 2004. So that's a little bit about me, and just a little bit about how this works, because we're still quite new and it's the second week of this class. So this is your virtual classroom. Now, on your right side, you can ask questions to me using the Q&A feature. You can also chat with your classmates. If there's something we're discussing where I might ask you to look up information, you can add information there. So it's really intended to be an interactive tool for us to have a great conversation and learn from each other. Now, some of this session I'm going to do a screen share with you, meaning that I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation that you will be able to see on your screen at home. Once I've completed the presentation, I'm going to take it off, and then I'll answer your questions, and at that time you'll be able to see me again. Now I'm going to go ahead and start the sharing of the video. But before I do that, I want to make sure that people out there are actually in the session and that you can see and hear everything. That perhaps you could write on the right side and acknowledge that you can see everything that's going on. Thank you. And meanwhile, I'm going to pull up the presentation. Now, I can see from the troubleshooting on our Facebook page that some people have problems hearing my voice. If that's it, could that challenge, and we'll try working with you and getting you to be able to see. Great, I see that it seems that for some of you, you can hear everything and see everything. What we'll do is I'll continue with the lecture, and meanwhile we have our mentor Christian, who's helping answer questions on the Facebook page if you have any problems hearing it. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the screen share again. Great. Now, today we're going to talk about climate change and climate refugees. And I've listed the agenda for today. So we're going to talk about our preparations and the lessons that we learned from the curriculum that you read in advance of this class. Now, if you're not completely done looking at all of the videos and exciting texts that I gave you, don't worry. I'm going to summarize some of the points that I found interesting, and then we'll have the opportunity to talk about it on Thursday as well. Before we get started, I also want to share some definitions, because I think that sometimes when we talk about climate refugees and tourists and exchange students and labor migrants, it gets really what's really what. So we'll talk about that a bit as well. Then we'll talk about climate change, climate refugees. What is the problem really? We'll specifically look at two different cases. The first case is the Maldives. I'm going to highlight how climate change is actively affecting the people who live on that island. And then we'll talk about the second case, which is the Carteret Islands, and also about how climate change is influencing that island in a bit of a different way, but also very important ways. Then we'll briefly talk about possible solutions, but you'll also be asked to come up with some possible solutions in the class on Thursday. We'll briefly talk about amazing adaptation skills, then the global challenges related to migration, two questions that you're expected to discuss in your Thursday group sessions, and then we have time for questions, and I expect that there'll be about 20 minutes for questions, and I hope that that'll be enough. Now, in advance of this class, you looked at Hans Rosling, who's a Swedish amazing guy who really knows how to work statistics. So we looked at his video about population and introduction to global population dynamics. We looked at a brief video and article about America's first climate refugees, and another one of Hans Rosling's videos about the best statistics or stats you've ever seen. And then we read the article, "The Era of Climate Change." The era of climate change refugees has begun. Now, so what are some of the things that we learned in advance of today's class? Well, from Hans Rosling, I think we learned quite a lot of things, and I was very fascinated about the way that he really works with statistics and visuals to illustrate how the world is changing. Both when it's in a graphic version, but also when he plays with his Lego. I think that he taught us that the challenge lies in getting the richest few to even out their carbon dioxide emissions to a level that's shareable with the people who are currently the poorest majority. And also that we should widely adapt renewable green energy sources. I think that he really states that, especially when living in the West, we have to be aware that people who do not live in the West eventually end up mirroring our behavior and our energy consumption. And that it's important that we already now think about that the goal should be living in a world where everyone has equal opportunities and equal access to energy. And then there also needs to be enough, and we want a sustainable future. So our sustainable future will never happen if people in the West, or if the richest majority, aren't willing to also change their behavior. Then another really interesting point from Hans Rosling is that the global poverty will even out over time. So that's one of his core arguments that he makes in the end of the first video. But then he also says at the same time that there's been no change in the number of people who belong to the poorest group, but only in the percentage of the world population. So what he says is that, let's say there were 1,000 in the world who were the poorest. The number is still the same because the population size has expanded. So I think that's really interesting, especially that he thinks that global poverty will even out over time. Now then, we watched and read about America's first climate refugees. And I thought it was interesting to add something to the mix that isn't necessarily about Asia and Pacific, although that's where most of you who are watching live are located. Now, that article and brief video told us that there are native communities in Latin America that are experiencing extreme flooding due to melting ice. And then we see this video from the Newtok village, and that that village may vanish away within the next 5 years. So basically what it is about is, due to the rise in global temperatures, the ice is melting and their village is fading away. And I thought that one of the really capturing moments from the video is when we see the young woman, I can't recall her name, but talks about how just the year previously, the border between the ice and the ocean was so much further away, but it comes closer and closer to her. So of course this means that eventually all of the villagers will have to leave. And then they argue that they are becoming America's first climate change refugees. Now, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, which is why I wrote afterwards permanent climate change refugees. Because I remember, for example, when I was in college and we had Hurricane Katrina, a lot of students from the universities in New Orleans were forced to move, and they actually came and joined a lot of our classes and moved into our dorm rooms with us. And so I think that they were also climate change refugees, but I think that that wasn't of a permanent nature necessarily. I mean, once people move, they might not end up going back, but after some time they did have the opportunity to go back. So I would agree that that these native communities may be the first permanent climate change refugees in America. But it is actually quite massive. So 186 native communities are in Alaska are affected by flooding. It's not just, an issue of people losing a place to live. It's also losing a part of American culture. And to put it in perspective, if we wanted to move or relocate just one of these native communities or one village, it would cost about $130 million. So it's not just an economic issue, it's also a cultural issue. It's obviously, for the people affected, a hugely personal issue. I think one of the interesting things, as you have seen in your readings, I always emphasize that climate change, as well as the term climate refugee, it's quite contested. And contested means that people don't really agree about it. Some people think it's true, some people think it's not true. But even in Alaska, where we're seeing such a huge impact on 186 native communities, it's still a very touchy subject. And there's not a lot of agreement on whether climate refugees truly exist, and whether the changes are due to man-made climate change, which is interesting. Some people say that might be due to their dependence on oil. And then even there is also, again, a cultural dimension, because even in the Newtok village, there are some people who believe that climate change is caused by negative emotions such as anger, hate, and envy. So again, there's obviously a lot of forces at play here, and I thought it was interesting to bring in a perspective from somewhere else. And here is a picture of the village. And if you didn't have a chance to go through their photo gallery, I strongly recommend the short 5 video. I thought that was very interesting to see it. Now, sometimes people say that definitions, that's something a little bit boring, but I think it's important that we know exactly, the differences between the type of migrants that exist. So for example, just before we dive into that, I put up a definition of climate change. In the homework, I asked all of you to kind of reflect about if you had some better or longer or more detailed definitions of climate change. I think it could be really interesting to hear which ones you find interesting. So you can either post some better or longer or more elaborate definitions of climate change in the Q&A window if you'd like. But the sort of basic introductory definition that I used is that climate change is a long-term change to the Earth's climate, and especially a change that happens due to an increase in the average atmospheric temperature. So you don't have to be a science nerd to know that this has something to do with actions by humans that influence, for example, the temperature of the Earth, and then something else, there's another reaction in the natural environment to that change in temperature. Again, so we're talking about refugees, and refugees, just like tourists and exchange students and labor migrants, fall into this larger category of migrants. So a migrant is a person who migrates, so again, or moves or travels to a location and remains there for more than 1 year. So basically, it's the act of moving somewhere and then staying for a year. And then a tourist, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with that and have had the opportunity to be a tourist either within your own country or going to other countries. I know that was the case when we talked last week, and I heard, some of you were living in different countries than the country that you were born in. A tourist is a person who's traveling for pleasure and does so less than 1 year. So here it has to do with, for example, that I really want to see the Eiffel Tower, so I go on a vacation, but I don't stay there permanently. Now we're getting to some of the other definitions that are more closely tied to what we're talking about today. So a refugee is defined as, so under the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention, a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside their country of his nationality, or is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. That's quite the mouthful. I think if you break it down to something more simple, what it basically means is that if you lived in a country and for some reason it's genuinely unsafe for you to, and forced to leave, then you're a refugee. Now, there might be a lot of different reasons why that happens. So even in the definition, you see it can be because of race, it can be because of your religious beliefs, it can be because of your nationality, for example, if you're a minority. So there's a lot of different things going on. I can share another example. My father lived in Iran, where he, due to his political opinions, was forced to flee the country during the Ayatollah Khomeini. So there was a shift in the religious beliefs, or a tightening of religion in the country at that time. And because he didn't believe in that, he was in danger and was forced to leave the country. So that's an example of a refugee. I know that within a Danish context, we see a lot of refugees from Syria, the conflict there. And I'm sure that all of you could think of really great examples of different reasons why people have been forced to leave their country and come to your particular country. Now, not to get too technical, climate refugees actually don't fall under the 51 Geneva Convention. So they don't necessarily enjoy the same protections. And I think that's quite problematic, but that's something that we'll get back to. Because as I said, when we prepared for this class, climate refugees, it's not a term that everyone really agrees on, both on whether or not they actually exist and whether they should have the same protections as what we could perhaps call refugees for racial or religious reasons. But the climate refugee is classified as an individual who's been displaced. So then what is displaced? That means, forced to or removed, from where they were originally. And the United Nations Environmental Program has designated climate change as one of its 6 priorities and has outlined the possible effects. So what we see here is that there is a clear definition of climate refugee. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not they should have the same rights as kind of regular or the type of refugees that we've been dealing with so far globally. Now, I think we need some more examples of climate refugees before we dive into the examples, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. climate refugees come from many different countries around the world. And I think that's really important to understand. So while this is particularly relevant in an Asia Pacific context, it really is. It's not just relevant in that context. Climate refugees are from all around the world. But some of the popular examples are what I already talked about, people who have been displaced due to Hurricane Katrina in the US. Again, we could argue that this might be of a temporary nature, not necessarily a permanent nature, because once the rebuilding of New Orleans takes place, they will have an opportunity to go back. Another example is internal migrants in Japan and Australia who've been displaced due to, again, in these situations, they may be able to go back. When we talk about internal migrants, that means that if they were from Japan, they're still in Japan. And if they were from Australia, they're still in Australia, because it's internally within that country they've been displaced. Depending on the circumstances, they may be able to go back and they may not. For example, if the drought is of a permanent nature, they might not be able to go back because it might not be able to sustain life there. Then another example is people who've been displaced as a result of their certification in East Africa. And then something finally we're going to talk a lot more about today is that a lot of peoples from the Pacific Islands have been threatened by rising sea levels. And what's interesting about this, we'll talk about, that's not, and you can't be displaced internally. So if an entire island goes missing, then obviously, first of all, you have to move to another country, but you can't go back. So that's quite different than, for example, from the Hurricane Katrina case in the US. So what's this problem with climate change and climate refugees? Well, it's actually a huge global problem that affects a lot of people. Now, according to the Environmental Justice Foundation, there are 20 million people classified as climate refugees. And climate change may force nearly 150 million climate refugees to move. Just at a conference about climate refugees, and these figures were very much discussed. Sometimes it's difficult, to classify and say, if we see someone who moves, for example, from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, did they really move because of Hurricane Katrina? Or did they move because of something else? Did they move because they were poor? Did they move because they, didn't feel they wanted to live there anymore for other reasons? It's really difficult, since we can't give every person who moves a questionnaire and ask, why did you really move? It's impossible to say whether these figures, and also to measure whether they're true. But I think what we really need to take away from it is that if we currently have 20 million people classified as climate refugees, and we expect it to rise to 150 million by 2050, then we need, it makes sense that they don't have the same rights as what I mistakenly call regular refugees, in lack of a better term. And then it's also problematic because climate refugees are forced to move, and it can be difficult both for them and for the community that they arrive to. So obviously, this is a two-part problem. If my country disappears, just try to imagine that everything that's around you right now goes missing. That's obviously going to have a huge impact on my life, on my family, on my beliefs, on my community, on my friends, on my belongings, my economy, on everything, on sort of every atom of who I am is going to be affected by this. But also, because it is still so expensive to migrate somewhere, it's going to hugely impact the countries around me, because it's not like someone from the Pacific is going to migrate to Denmark. They're going to migrate to the countries or islands that are closest to them. And what's going to happen if the population on a particular other island goes, through the roof and just expands? All kinds of other issues are going to happen due to that. And then I think that my last point is just for a bit of perspective. So right now, it's the equivalent of almost the entire population of Australia that's currently classified as climate refugees. That's really a lot of people. And it hasn't really been on the media agenda as much as it could have. I mean, we've known that this, as researchers, that this was happening for quite some time. But I think sometimes not being, especially by the popular media, who, you know, not everywhere in the world do we already believe that climate change as a result of human action is in fact taking place. But when you start to talk about climate refugees, they sometimes treat you as if you believe in science fiction. So it is obviously, you know, the media does also play a large role in this issue. Briefly, I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide, but I wanted to say, you know, for example, that the Australian Refugee Council, who has been designed to protect the rights of refugees coming to Australia, they actually don't recognize the term climate refugee. And I think one of the reasons or concerns is that once you're protected under the label of being a refugee, you have a lot of rights that you're granted by the countries that you come to. And I think that sometimes organizations are worried that if we add this whole other group of people, then we can't give them those rights. So I think that, you know, an argument is that if someone comes from war, they think that they're more of a legitimate refugee than if someone comes because the ocean has risen surrounding their home. They think that that's more of a right reason to move. Personally, I am a little bit critical of this, but it's obviously up to each individual to decide, you know, what they believe. On the contrary, there are also, you know, some people who have begun to take the issue of climate change and climate refugee. For example, most of you may remember, some of you are quite young, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who in February 2003 said that we face a situation in which 50 million people in Asia could be killed or displaced by floods. And then, so this is particularly related to the region that we're talking about today. But he mentions a bunch of different changes in the climate, and he was a part of making it legitimate for state leaders to really talk about climate refugees and say, you know, people are going to die or are going to have to move if we don't do something about this issue. So that was really important. Now, for the final 10 minutes, I'm briefly going to outline some different examples to, again, kind of help illustrate what it is that we have been discussing. And then when we get to the group work, we can talk more about these issues. We can look deeper into examples and also examples from your own home countries. The first case is from the Maldives. I think many people know the Maldives as this fantastic vacation island, but they have also been severely suffering as a result of climate change. And as you can see in this sort of introductory picture, there's an official government meeting taking place under the ocean or at the bottom of the ocean. A meeting in 2012 where we see the fisheries minister signing a declaration. So the minister who takes care of anything related to the fishing industry, which is quite large in the Maldives. Now, what's really going on there, and why should we care about that? The Maldives is the 6th smallest sovereign state in terms of land size in the world. And basically, the island is quite flat and located just above the ocean, with an altitude of 1.5 meters, which makes it very vulnerable to climate change. So what kind of climate change? Lots of different things, particularly rise in the ocean level, but not only that, but we'll get back to that again. So the entire population has a very small portion of land. So it's surrounded by the ocean, and it's prone to natural disasters. So that means natural disasters happen there quite often. Outside of that, if you just look at the actual island, they have quite poorly developed infrastructure. So that means like roads and housing. They have quite limited resources, limited ability to grow something on the island. And then they're economically dependent on other countries. Particularly, again, we tend to think about this island as this paradise for tourists. So when we say they're economically dependent on other countries, they're very dependent on holding money on the island. So there's been a lot of different forecasts about how the Maldives will be affected by climate change. But even if you look at the most skeptical forecast, it looks like a pretty bad situation. And the president made this, I think, very interesting and very great quote that really reveals the gravity of the situation, saying, we have a written history of more than 2,000 years, and we don't want to trade our paradise for a climate refugee camp. And in an effort to create awareness about the island, they held these, as we saw in the previous picture. I'll show you again. And having these official meetings under at the bottom of the ocean. They both had it in October 2009 and again in 2012. It's kind of signaling that in the future, the island could quite literally be underwater. And then I think, again, when we talk about climate change, particularly in a setting of an island, we tend to think that it's, the only issue is that the water rises so that land disappears. But when we say that climate change is a very real issue for the people living in the Maldives, it's not only about the fact that the water will rise. It's really about understanding that this is a threat to their way of life. It's a threat to every piece of infrastructure, because floodings, prevent you from going to school, prevent you from getting access to water. For example, in 2004, when we had the tsunami, they had to close down the airport. But when you have an island that almost entirely depends on tourism, but also transportation, like they need the airport to bring in food for the local population, then that's really a dangerous situation. Also, the primary industry on the island is the fishing industry, and then you tend to think, well, if the ocean becomes larger because it swallows more of the island, shouldn't that be great for the people fishing? Actually, it's not great, because first of all, they're also dependent on people being able to take what they fish. I come back to our fishing industry on the island. That gets destroyed, so it's a problem for them to get rid, or to sell, not get rid of, but to sell the things, because you can't transport it anywhere. But also, again, there's these elaborate processes behind climate change. So, for example, a rise in water temperature could also change the fish life that lives there. So it's a very complex issue, and I think it's creating an island who has an image of being very wealthy, a total paradise for only the wealthiest tourists. But they will actually end up needing foreign aid and assistance, and I think most importantly, there will be a loss of sovereignty over their land, or a loss of land. Like they will, or could. I mean, let's hope it doesn't come to this. They could lose their island. And the final point is also, what's going to happen when or if people choose to leave? What kind of stability will be in the region? I'm going to kind of quickly go through our second example from Papua New Guinea, because we're running a little short on time, and I really, really want to be able to answer some of all of your questions. And I can see you've been active in putting in the questions and comments, and I really welcome that. So we have the Carteret is a small group of islands in the Pacific Ocean. Now, in December 2008, the called king tidal waves, so huge waves and storms that hugely affected the island, and to such an extent that the people are actually preparing to permanently leave the island. And again, I assure you this isn't because they want to, it's because it's slowly not becoming possible to live there. Unfortunately, relocating is very difficult. So relocating means moving somewhere else. So moving all the people somewhere else is really slow. It's very difficult. And since they also depend on food and resources from the outside, which only come very few times a year, the general population is both hungry and unwell. And I think, again, we have to think about what happens in communities here where the climate changes drastically, their way of life is deteriorating, and the water level rises. It also becomes sort of breeding ground for lots of diseases that can be transmitted through the water, or when water flows through some of the sanitary solutions we normally have. This makes the island at risk of a spread of bacteria. So that's also a very important factor. And then again, the rise of the tidal waves really meant that they can't grow the crops, so they can't grow the food that they used to depend on. So in a way, we start by, they can't create their way of life anymore. So they're forced to leave even before the island disappears. In a way, they can't live there anymore. And I brought two quotes with me. One of them says, not only are homes displaced, crops can no longer grow to an increase in salinity in the soils. So again, that's a very direct consequence. And then the second quote is more related to identity and the feeling that the people have as a result of what's going on. And that's relocating for us is our only means of building a future. We will lose our identity, but we have no choice. The islands are shrinking. Now, I'm quickly just going to talk about, what are some of the possible solutions, just to inspire you guys to find more solutions. Well, I think that when we look for solutions, we need to really look towards technology, innovation, and adaptation. So, for example, there's a bunch of scientists working on practical solutions to deal with the problems. So one of the things you can work on is protective walls. So where you build seawalls to protect islands. And I think, everyone knows that that's a temporary solution, but it might hold back some climate-induced effects for some years. Some others actively, expand beaches or harbors. So we have an example from the Netherlands, where they're coastal engineers. So now that's an example from Europe, but they're also, quite at risk of their entire country being swallowed by the ocean. So they work with coastal engineers in improving their beaches and to avoid shrinking. I also wrote, could one of the solutions be a wider recognition of climate change refugees, and even also of climate change in general? And we can talk more about that in the group session. And then I think what's really interesting is that when humans are faced with difficult situations, some will choose to move and some will choose to adapt. Of course, if you live in an island that's going to be entirely swallowed by the ocean, that's difficult to adapt to in terms of staying and creating a different type of life. So if your island is swallowed by the ocean, you can't just. But what if your entire island or your entire neighborhood isn't swallowed? What if there's just higher waters? Can you change your lifestyle? Can you incorporate a daily routine that involves a boat? There are a lot of really amazing examples of adaptation strategies out there. And I'm not going to show them to you. I'm going to encourage you to find them on your own. And then just kind of ending the session, I want to say that when we talk about climate change and climate refugees, we have to understand that that's just a little part of a larger narrative and of a larger global movement of people. So there is a huge movement of people, and there always has been, and they're both within countries and across national borders. And then each country has perhaps many different types of migrants, and that people move under different circumstances. That creates a lot of different opportunities in the communities and a lot of different challenges. So when I talk about opportunities, I generally believe that when people from different countries meet each other and live together, that creates innovation and that creates more tolerant people. And I think it's a good thing when people meet each other and live, not just like me, a person from Denmark, living in Denmark surrounded by Danish people. But I'm happy that there are people from different places in Denmark. But I mean, it would be naive to say that it doesn't also create challenges. And that's a lot of what I deal with in my work. You know, what happens when people from completely different countries are forced, for example, to move to a different country. And I think for me, you know, migration in general is a really big part of sustainability, because we want to ensure in the future that there's not just enough resources, but there's enough resources for us all to have equal rights to. And I think sustainability is also, it's not just about nature, it's also about the way in which we treat each other. I think it's also a way of life. It's about respect. It's about not only wanting to share resources, but generally believing that we're all equal and therefore should be treated equally in all aspects of our lives.